Am I audible? Okay, great. Thank you. So welcome to today's talk on combating hate and preventing hate crimes. On behalf of United for Peace, I would like to welcome all of you to this very important discussion on understanding and combating the root causes of hate and reducing hate crimes. Today, almost all of us see a growing climate of hate around us in some form or the other, be it social media or a form of hate speech, aggressiveness, or in our physical world, where we see a growing number of incidents targeting a specific group. So, religious hate crimes or discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So, we are extremely fortunate to have one of the most foremost experts on this subject in the United States with us today, Mr. Kenneth Stern. But before I introduce him, I would like to give a brief introduction of United for Peace and our activities and what we do as an organization. So this is our mission statement. United for Peace is a grassroots movement of citizens who work to promote understanding in our communities where we live, respect and unity across all differences, whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, country of origin, gender, and many others, and essentially promote nonviolence and peace throughout our world. Our overall goal is to create robust and healthy communities with inclusion and respect for everyone within them. And all the programs and activities we do as an organization are designed to further these goals. So here are a few examples of some of the activities that we do. So this is interfaith and intercultural activities, programs to reduce hate crimes, promote nonviolence, and overall conflict resolution workshops. So yeah, again, so these are some of the examples of stuff that we've done in the past. So an interfaith vigil for victims of hate crimes, again, interfaith tours of gurdwaras and religious locations, supporting racial justice through protests. So for example, Black Lives Matter, UN Peace Day celebration in Chicago, a conflict resolution and nonviolence workshop, a vigil for gun violence victims, celebrating Mahatma Gandhiji's birthday and nonviolence overall. And lastly, we have another example of an international expo that was done. So now I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker, Mr. Kenneth Stern. So Mr. Kenneth Stern is an award-winning author and attorney, as well as the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, a program of the Human Rights Project at Bard College, which he graduated from in 1975. Mr. Stern was most recently executive director of the Justice and Karen Rosenberg Foundation, and before that was the director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee. Our renowned speaker has been publishing his ideas and educating other people for decades, arguing before the United States Supreme Court, testifying before Congress, and even presenting at the White House Conference on Hate Crimes. Mr. Stern's book reviews and op-eds have appeared in numerous well-known sources, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. He has also been featured on the CBS Evening News, Good Morning America, and many other TV and radio programs, including NPR's All Things Considered. We are extremely excited and honored to present Mr. Kenneth Stern for our talk on combating hate and preventing hate crimes. Thank you, Mr. Stern. I think I'll pass it over to you now.
Well, thank you all very much for inviting me to share an hour or so with you. And I just want to make clear that it's not just going to be for an hour. I'll give you my email. And if the things that I could be helpful with your work or questions in the aftermath, just email me. It's kstern@bard.edu. In any event, I think I'm going to spend about 35, 40 minutes giving an overview of maybe some new ways for you to think about hate and how we approach what we do about it. And then I'd be happy to take the conversation wherever it's most useful to you. So how do we think about hate? There are some bromides that I think are comforting, but they seem to suggest that hate is simple. And actually, it's rather complicated. One of the bromides, which I think at least the older folks in in the group would know is sort of what I call the South Pacific view of hate, that you have to be carefully taught of how to hate. Well, I think you have to be taught maybe who to hate, but the instinct to hate is part of sort of our natural development as human beings. I'm not saying that we are ordained to hate, but the capacity, the instinct is there. When I was at the American Jewish Committee, and I was there for 25 years, whenever there was a hate crime, whether it was against Jews or blacks or anyone else, we would frequently have an ad that was actually a very attractive ad that we print in the local newspaper, and it showed cuddly different, babies of different skin color, all in diapers, just sort of sitting up in their diapers, and the tagline was "No one was born hating." And I was probably the only person on staff who actually intensely disliked, I wouldn't say hate, but I intensely disliked that poster because it seemed to suggest again that if you're not somehow polluted, it's not going to happen. That you see the world in a hateful way. And if you think about it, no one's born speaking either, but we're pre-wired or hardwired, depending on how you want to look at it, to have the capacity to speak. And I think the capacity to hate is also something that's innate in human beings. If you think about it, we've had hate no matter when, no matter where, no matter what political system, no matter what economic system, no matter what major religion. We've always had the capacity to define who is us and who is them. And the idea of hate studies, and you heard I directed a Center for the Study of Hate, is dedicated to the idea of trying to pull together from the different disciplines to this aspect of the human condition to give us better answers of how to deal with it. It came about, basically, there was some of you who may remember back in the 70s and 80s up until the 90s or early 90s, there was a group called the Aryan Nations in the Idaho Panhandle, which was sort of the ground zero for neo-Nazi white supremacist activity in the United States, and it spurred groups including the Order, which robbed banks. Some of you may remember the Randy Weaver siege in northern Idaho. Randy Weaver was a frequent guest at the Aryan Nations. And what happened in that community was that there was a local parish priest named Bill Wasmuth, who was upset by the fact that this group was there promoting hate and really being responsible for a lot of hateful violence. And he started speaking out when the group was posing threats to a few Jews and a few blacks and others in the community. And in response, he got his house firebombed with him in it. But he was thankfully unharmed. He decided to leave the priesthood, organized a group called the Northwest Coalition, and it was throughout the Pacific Northwest organizing people on how to deal with hate, how to deal with hate crimes, and so forth. And I used to go and do workshops for them on anti-Semitism. And then one year, Bill asked me to give a keynote. And I said, Bill, what do you want me to do? And he said, challenge us to do something we're not already doing. And I said to him, Bill, that's a hard ask. You're the model that I tell other people around the country to emulate. And then it occurred to me that I was coming from my day job. A lot of other people from different ethnic and religious groups were coming from their day jobs. There were police that were coming to it. There were people from labor unions. But the academics that were coming mostly because they were personally interested. It wasn't, something really associated with something that they were on the clock for. And, it became clear that what he was doing and we were doing at AJC and all the other groups that I knew about were actually reacting to hate mostly by common sense or the seat of our pants. There was no real desire or attempt or data bank of information about what do you do, what don't you do, why, how do you look at hatred in a holistic way. So the idea was to build something very similar to what we do with medicine, for example, because people get sick and we want to have an interdisciplinary approach to giving answers to that. So from biology and physics and chemistry and so forth, or architecture, because we need structure. So we pull from physics and math and art and so forth. And hate studies is the attempt to do that. It started in the late 90s in Gonzaga University. And it's defined as inquiries into the human capacity to define and then dehumanize or demonize another, and the processes which inform or give expression to or can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. And if you notice from the definition, it looks at really two types of hate. One is sort of the visceral, angry type of hatred that we're all very familiar with, but it also, by focusing on dehumanization and demonization, also looks at the type of hate that's normative. It doesn't get people's blood boiling, but just as a people think of, well, this is just how the world is. Slavery, for example. So, I just want to share with you some of the insights of what hate studies has produced to understand a little bit more about hatred works. And if anyone wants, email me. I'll send you the PDF of the first chapter of my last book that deals with the Israel-Palestine campus debate. But I go into how we think about groups and who's us and who's them, and I'll send you a link to that chapter. So, if you think about it, evolutionary psychology, for example, tells us something about our capacity to hate. There's a guy named Jim Waller who did an article years ago looking at hatred and basically saying, look, the human brain was developed thousands and thousands of years ago. And if you think rationally about it, we should all be much more scared of automobiles than spiders and snakes. But I don't know about you, but I have more of a visceral reaction to spiders and snakes than I do to automobiles. And that's partly because that's how our brains were formed. We were formed when the group over the hill might pose a danger to us, and we didn't know who they were. So the human minds are defined, to develop to define the limits of the tribe. We construct seeing the world by who's an us and who's a them. And we tend to be biased towards the us's and label them as enemies. And we're hardwired to be ethnocentric. And there's studies that show we think our group is better when other groups don't measure up and may be dangerous to us. And this is across cultures. Ethnocentric impulses have been documented, and even from an early age. And we see that in our daily news feeds and in our sports pages. But defining what an in-group is also requires what it's not. So there's ethnocentrism and xenophobia, which means fearing others. And although there's evidence that the two aspects are independent, somewhat independent, a person can favor their in-group, for example, and discriminate against an out-group without any animus towards the out-group. The affinity to one's own group is apparently the stronger force. And there's brain science that suggests this too. There's a webinar I did. Well, actually, I hosted it. I do it with Robert Sapolsky. He's probably the world's greatest brain scientist. I think it's had like 138,000 views on YouTube. And here's basically what his point is. He said, the human mind's propensity for us versus them thinking runs deep. Numerous careful studies have shown that the brain makes such distinctions automatically and with mind-boggling speed. Stick a volunteer into a brain scanner and quickly flash pictures of faces. Among typical white subjects in the scanner, the sight of a black man's face activates the amygdala, a brain region central to emotions of fear and aggression, in under 1/10 of a second. In most cases, the prefrontal cortex, a region crucial for impulse control and emotional regulation, springs into action a second or two later and silences the amygdala. Don't think that way. That's not who I am. Still, the initial reaction is one usually of fear, even among those who know better. This finding is no outlier. He said, looking at the face of someone of the same race activates a specialized part of the primitive brain called the fusiform cortex, which recognizes faces, but is activated less so when the face in question is that of someone of another race. Watching the hand of someone of the same race being poked with a needle activates the anterior, I'm going to mispronounce this, cingulate cortex, a region implicated in feelings of empathy. And being shown the same with the hand of a person of another race produces less activation. So not everyone's face or pain counts equally. there are other parts of the brain too that also ones that dealing with disgust that are relevant here. There's social psychology that tells us a lot too. If we were all together in a room, I could flip a coin and divide us into group A and group B. And even though everybody knew their selection to one group or the other was entirely random, after each group forms their own identity, each group, the people inside each group will think of their group as smarter, more attractive, and so forth. That's just how we're sort of primed to see the world. Um, there are other social psychological studies too that show that when it's a group that we see as opposed to us, um, we tend to be prejudiced towards them. But when we actually, I'll mention one of them that gives a little bit of a hopeful sign called Robbers Cave. It was in the 50s. There was a social psychologist that took a bunch of 12-year-old boys that were like peas in a pod to a summer camp in Oklahoma. They were white, they were middle class, they're from intact homes, they were all Protestant, and they didn't know that the other group existed until they started seeing evidence of the other group's existence, and they started stealing flags and raiding bunks, and it was more than just pranks. This was really bullying and almost like gangster-like behavior, and it carried on that way until they had to work together to fix a water supply, because otherwise they couldn't have water. So the suggestion is that when you can, it's a hopeful suggestion that when you build bridges and you bring people together for a common goal, it can create networks and reduce prejudice. And one of the things I saw at AJC at intergroup work, for example, is that the groups like Blacks and Jews, dialogue groups, the ones that lasted were the ones that had another layer of identity, Black and Jewish lawyers or accountants or so forth. So anyway, that's some of the social psychology. There's also something called uncertainty identity theory, that when you feel uncertain about your perceptions, attitudes, or values, that could be uncomfortable and motivate a desire for reducing uncertainty. And it's motivating because people need to know who they are, how to behave, and what to think, who others are, and how they might behave and think and treat us. And groups that have sharp boundaries are internally homogenous and have a clear structure with shared goals and a common fate are better at reducing uncertainty, and provides a clearer sense of who they are as a group. And this is especially so made extreme when their identity is perceived under threat. So religion has a place here. In some ways, we can see politics today almost having aspects of religion to intense group identity. And there's one more element here too about a desire of people, a tendency to define themselves in a way that depersonalizes others and themselves. There's a scholar named Michael Hogg who wrote, "We depersonalize the thems in terms of their group's prototype, viewing them stereotypically and creating stereotype consistent expectations about their attitudes and behavior. When we categorize ourselves, precisely the same process occurs. We depersonalize ourselves in terms of an in-group prototype. We conform to and internalize group norms, define ourselves in group terms, and feel a sense of belonging and identification with our group. This identification is so strong that we feel pain when someone in our group fails, but take pleasure when someone else in a rival group fails." We also crave authority. I'm not, anybody's interested, I can go into some of the, Stanley Milgram and other, social psychological studies that show that we tend to gravitate towards authority figures. And there are studies that show that we don't like to be the outlier. There's one, Solomon Asch, that's a classic study in social psychology, that you bring people into a room and it's all sort of rigged. The last person sitting there is the one that they're doing the experiment on, and they go around a table and answer simple questions, and everybody gets it right until everybody starts saying something that's obviously wrong, and the pressure is on the person at the end to either go with the group or to speak out and say no, they're wrong. And 76% of people give at least one wrong answer in that way. It's also to understand this one, it's a book I recommend. Although it's not about hate per se, but it's really very interesting in the politics and how this works in moral terms. There's a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt who teaches at the New York University's Business School. And he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And he has a number of points which I will share with you. So that really there are two different kinds of cognition. There's intuition and there's reasoning. And he compares it to an elephant and a rider. He says our intuitions are what really drive us, like the elephant, and we're the rider that can steer the intuitions a little bit, but mostly we're just along for the ride. He said if you ask people to believe something that violates their intuitions, they will devote their efforts to finding an escape hatch, a reason to doubt your argument or conclusion. They will almost always succeed. Says people bind themselves into political teams that share moral narratives. Once they accept a particular narrative, they become blind to alternative moral worlds. So when a group of people make something sacred, the members of the cult lose their ability to think clearly about it. Said extreme partisanship may be literally addictive. Said the love of loyal teammates is matched by a corresponding hatred of traitors, who are usually considered to be far worse than enemies. And he asks, why do people so readily treat objects, flags and crosses, places like Mecca or a battlefield related to the birth of your nation, saints and heroes, and principles, liberty, fraternity, equality, as though they were infinite value? Whatever its origins, the psychology of sacredness helps bind people into moral communities. When someone is in a moral community, desecrates one of the sacred pillars, supporting the community, the reaction is sure to be swift, emotional, collective, and punitive. So that anything that binds people together into a moral matrix that glorifies the in-group, while at the same time demonizing another group, can lead to moralistic killing, and many religions are well suited for this task. So what does this teach us? It teaches when people care passionately about an issue, especially when they perceive that issue as linked to the survival of their group, which they see as at risk, this tendency to have intuitions drive what we think is heightened. And at its extreme, this is the stuff that makes suicide bombers or soldiers who commit atrocities or those who commit hate crimes. There's an economist too who I won't go into great detail because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion and talking about what he do about all this. But a guy named Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner, and he had something very similar to Jonathan Haidt. He talks about system one and system two as opposed to the elephant and the rider. And system one is the sort of simple stuff that you think, 2 + 2 = the answer, or bread and the system two is the more complex thing, how to fill out a tax form, or what's 17 by 37. So he said his basic point was that system two, the more complicated one, is lazy. And we have a tendency to rely on system one and to be more overconfident in our intuitions that way, because it's uncomfortable to deal with complexity. We like simplicity. And that's where we go to. We go to our body and our way our minds are programmed to simple answers to complex questions. We're lazy thinkers, especially in that type of circumstance. He also points out that the consistency of information is what people tend to crave for, especially when they're in this, sort of us versus them thinking. We look for a good story and not its completeness. He calls it what you see is all there is. We don't think about what other pieces of the puzzle. We tend to look at it from our tribal perspective and not really have the empathy to think about what else is going on here that we may be missing. He also talks about what he calls denominator neglect. We tend to see something that may be a horrible incident, whether it's a hate crime or just something with statistics about the mortality rate of a disease, and we tend to, he calls it denominator neglect. We tend to think of something that's, unusual or episodic. We tend to think of it as ubiquitous. So, I could go on longer, but this is basically what the field of hate studies are trying to pull together from the different fields, brain science, social psychology, and other fields, to give us some direction. So, what's happened since that first, Gonzaga conference, which was 19 years ago? We don't have full answers, but we have a lot more academic energy, so that we're not running by the seat of our pants all the time, and it's encouraging. It's still early in the building of the field, but Gonzaga is still there. This is one at the University of California at San Bernardino, Ontario, Ireland, England, one of Pitt's and Carnegie Mellon. UCLA has a great one that's doing a lot of great research. There's an international network, and the one I lead at Bard College also is empowering faculty and students. We're the first place that has a a hate studies initiative, and we've been encouraging discussion across disciplines, so people are not just teaching in their silos. As I mentioned, we have webinars, public programs. You email me, I'll put you on our list. But we also have publications too, which I will talk about a little bit, that may be of some utility to you, especially since you're concerned about how hate manifests. One is just put out this year, the economic cost of hate crime. All these are available on our website, and the idea is that we don't, we categorize the cost of everything: potholes, obesity, not of hate. And we started thinking about, okay, so that's a large subject. Where do we start? And just to look at the cost of hate crimes, and we used as a model to show the different types. 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, the mass murder at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, to talk about the indirect and the direct costs and the long-term costs, and the law enforcement costs and so forth. So just to think about not just the moral terms, but the economic costs, the tax on all of us that hate brings, is something that I think the field is going to push. There's another, which came out in 2021. We're having another one coming out in September, called the State of Hate Index. And those of you who are old enough may remember that there was something called the Green Book, which was telling African American folks traveling in the South where they could stay, where they could eat, where they couldn't stay, and where they couldn't eat. And which was actually based on, there was a similar book about where Jews could go and couldn't go in the Catskills. And the idea was that there's a geographic location to hate. There's not just the hate crimes, but there's also the laws on the books. So if you're in Montana or Idaho, it's different than being in New York or Illinois, for example. And this came out 9 months before the Dobbs decision, which really drove home the idea that it really does matter where you are. And then the one that I think that maybe has the most utility for your group is called the Community Guide for Opposing Hate. And what that was is, when I started working at AJC in the late 80s, there was a group called the Center for Democratic Renewal that had put out What Do You Do When the Klan Comes to Town in the early to mid 80s. And it was a sort of a good guide for how do you organize in the community against hate and hate crimes. And then when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, I had a colleague who I worked with in Montana, the head of the Montana Human Rights Network, put out something called What to Do When the Militia Comes to Town. And there hadn't been anything since, certainly not in the days of since the days of social media. And I was getting increasingly frustrated by the fact that my wife she's now retired, but she's a rabbi in a congregation in the Rockaways in New York. And every year or two, there'd be a hate crime of some type there. And people would galvanize, they would come together. What do we do? They put a lot of energy. Do we have a program? Do we have a meeting? Do we have a speaker? And then things would dissipate. And then it would happen again. And I thought, gee, to have a manual that walks you through, how do you set up a group? How do you work with other groups? How do you work with journalists? How do you work with police? How do you work with politicians? What do you do in different scenarios? If there's the drag queen story hour gets protested, if there's a attack on the human rights groups there, how do you do research on the groups in your community that may pose a threat? And again, so all that, it's like 100 pages long, but it really is a very good nuts and bolts guide. And one of the things it does, it underscores something which I think is a very good tactic when dealing with hate or hate crimes, because we have a tendency to want to shut down and suppress and censor messages of hate, whether we see it on, in the real world or social media and so forth. And I'm a firm believer in the importance of protecting free speech, not to ignore hateful speech, certainly to condemn the hateful speech, but not to use instruments of state to deprive somebody else of the rights to speak. And that's, partly having grown up in the civil rights movement, Vietnam War era, whenever the government tried to stop speech, it was the speech of progressive folks. It was the speech the government didn't like. So one of the tools for dealing with hate crimes or hate groups activity is something called Project Lemonade, and we use that in you may remember back in right after Trump was elected. So this was in early 2017. There was a group of neo-Nazi skinheads that were going to march in a town called Whitefish, Montana. They had threatened, some people there had threatened the local Jewish community. And what we did is we worked with the local human rights groups and used the internet to have people make pledges of money tied to, if these guys marched, they would in fact be raising money for things that they detested. So it turned their free speech rights on the head. So they would have been raising money for anti-bias education. They would have been raising money for police training on hate crimes. They would have been raising money for security for the Jewish community there and others in the human rights community who were getting threatened. What it did also is it gave people in that community a sense that others had their back no matter where they were in the world, and it gave people wherever they were in the world something more concrete to do than just put a like on Facebook. So there's that strategy, which is very much part of that program. I'm always happy to talk in more detail about it. Let me tell you some of the other things that we're doing, and I hope to have created. I can't promise, but this is some of the things we're thinking about, and the ideas may be useful to you too. That instance that I just talked about with the Montana was one of the things that got us thinking about this. The other was there was 2020. There was a woman who was a friend of a friend who lived in the northern Idaho, not far from where the Aryan Nations was actually, and she had a Biden lawn sign, and it kept getting picked up and replaced with a Confederate flag. And it happened one time, two times, three times. The police didn't come, despite her calling the police. Sixth time they finally came after whoever was putting the flag there also took some paint and splattered it all over her patio. And so I talked to her because my friend connected me, and I happen to know, what do you do when the police aren't responding adequately? What do you do with getting support, emotional support? Where are the resources for that? Who are the human rights groups in Idaho? I happen to know those folks because I've worked with them over the years. And then I thought, why is it that it has to be somebody like me that can, anticipate what this person might need as resources? So we're working together with the BU Business School to develop a plan, which we hope we can get funded, to do a clearinghouse on hate. To have, because the resources are out there. It's just they're, again, segmented and they're in separate silos, and to really create, using AI, a way to connect people with the types of resources that they might not even know that they need, but they can get if there's a conduit like that. So that's one of the things we're trying to do. One of the other things we're trying to do is we're going to have a book come out in 2024 where I went to a lot of the people who've been doing some of the cutting edge work on hate in various different fields. And I asked them if they were advising a non-governmental organization, groups like the Northwest Coalition I mentioned, or the ADL or NAACP or any other group that was working on hatred writ large, or a particular aspect of it, knowing what they know from their expertise, what would they do, what wouldn't they do, and why? It's again going back to let's stop running these organizations by the seat of our pants or what feels good or what's going to bring in fundraising and so forth. So we have an economist, a philosopher. The philosopher, by the way, I, it's very, interesting. We were talking about the ethics of all this, and so one of the ways it's going to approach it is sort of a, should there be a Hippocratic oath for groups that are working on issues of hatred? First, do no harm. And how do we know we're not doing harm? So he's going to explore some of that. We have a social psychologist, a brain scientist. We have two of the leading hate crime experts, one from Ireland, one from the UK, whose work focuses on not just thinking about it in the academy, but actually working with the police on the ground. We have an anthropologist who's looking at the effectiveness and how to use counter speech. So again, we tend to want to suppress the speech we don't like. Instead, how do you use our capacity to speak effectively to turn the tables on them, not just the Project Lemonade, but more broadly. And then, it's a telling thing that I thought that we needed somebody who looks at conspiracy theories because they're so prevalent today, and we see it affecting our politics and hatred. And it's interesting when I think about it, because when I wrote my book on the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a lot about conspiracy theories that was driving a lot of how the people in the militias at the time were seeing the world. The Soviet Union, the evil empire, disappeared. A colleague of mine named Lenny Zeskin was the first to describe that was okay. There's no more evil empire as a conspiracy, and we're cutting and pasting it, looking internally at the federal government at the time. So those were the folks that were having conspiracy theory driving them to some great acts of violence, including the Oklahoma City bombing, but more broadly the intimidation of people and communities and so forth. But that was on the fringe. And now we see it not only QAnon, but we see it in our politics as well. The conspiracy theories about the election and so forth. So there's a very good model I wanted to share with you from the guy I worked with on the militias back then, talking about conspiracy theories. And what he said about the militias, and I think it applies now equally, he said the militias were a funnel moving through space. And what he meant by that was that at the wide end of the funnel, there were people being sucked into these conspiracies, into the militias by mainstream issues. It was gun control and federal land use issues out in the West. And once you got into that funnel, you started getting exposed to conspiratorial thinking in your in-group. They're out to get us, and thinking in terms of the way conspiracy theories lead you. Then when you get further into the funnel, you get to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which are the oldest tried and true ones. And then out of the small end of the funnel pop the Timothy McVeighs and the Terry Nichols and the other people that are going to turn their whole identity over to seeing the world this way. And what's useful to me is that says that it's a system. The more people you push into the big end, the more people are going to pop out of the small end. So what you want to do is try to reduce the number of people going into the big end. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is to figure out ways to make it less likely that people get sucked into the system. So some lessons about what to do and not do, then I want to engage in a conversation. So one thing to remember is that hate isn't easy. So when people suggest easy answers to it, at the very least, they're incomplete, and they're also possibly and sometimes probably wrong. That we see some of that today, that sort of simple binary easy answer thinking. Also, I see some groups that are opposing hate also engaging in it. For example, the ideas of race and privilege and power are important when you look at issues of how hate plays out, but it's not the entire filter. It's not the entire lens to look at how hatred works, because hatred is complicated. Just as, classical Marxists wanted to say, okay, everything is about economics and class. You know, it's part of the puzzle, but not the entire puzzle. So when people suggest that there's a simple answer, sort of like a Hogwarts sorting hat to looking at hatred, be aware that there's attempts, again, as I was saying, to ban speech we don't like. I mean, we see it. I see people in the Jewish community doing it about things about certain pro-Palestinian speech, and that's a whole other conversation. I disagree with some of that pro-Palestinian speech, but I'm more concerned when trying to use instruments of state. But we see, with DeSantis about teaching about gender or teaching about race and so forth. There's attempts to do that and attempts on both sides to do that. And I think there's a temptation to in colleges and other places to push certain norms of what speech should and shouldn't be, as opposed to examining it critically. And that also, to me, is counterproductive on a college campus these days. I think when we have you're going off to college and shortly, I mean, the idea in college is to be disturbed by ideas. It's not to be made to feel safe. It's to have your thinking shaken up in a safe place, and then figure out, because you're going to be disturbed by ideas for the rest of your life, how do I negotiate this? How do I think about it? And there's too much of if somebody says the wrong word, we're going to pounce on them. And that to me is a problem. Two other points, and then I'll stop. One is that we tend to think about all different types of hatred with the very narrow lens. And this is what I say to the Jewish community, even just being self-interested audiences about anti-Semitism. And what I'll tell them is, look, everybody sees the Tree of Life shooting as an act of anti-Semitism. Clearly, nobody would ever say that the shooting at the El Paso Walmart a few months later was an act of anti-Semitism. It wouldn't compute. But if you look at the ideology of the two shooters, and remember that at the time, there was a lot of talk about invaders coming across the border from the south, and the shooter in the synagogue believed that, okay, well, there was a pro-immigration group called Hayas that was meeting at the synagogue. I'm going to go and stop, the invasion by going after that group. The person in El Paso had the same ideology, just picked a different target. So when we look at a narrow lens of whose ox is being gored, let alone what is being said about a particular group, and not looking at the dynamics that lead people to commit these types of acts, and they're usually, the ideologies are connected in some way. Anti-Semitism may explain why they think that they're losing the world, their world, because Jews are behind the scenes pulling the strings, but the people that they're afraid of are also ones that they're afraid to lose to, are also ones targeting for attack. And we look at them, two separately. Finally, I see, a correlation with the threat to democracy and our ability to fight hate and hate crimes. When people talk about anti-Semitism, they frequently say it's the canary in the coal mine for democracies. They come against Jews, and then everybody else, including the democratic system, is under threat. And that's true historically, but the flip side is also true, that when you have democracies under stress, when you have free speech and a free press, and you have the integrity of the courts and the independence of the courts under stress, that's an environment which, to me, means that it's more likely that politicians and others are going to be able to tap into the us versus them messages. And when that happens, hatred is likely to grow, and our ability to combat it. So that's an important aspect to keep in mind too. Preserving democracy is probably one of the most important things we could do to oppose hate. And again, just the final word is if you see somebody telling you that hatred is simple, they're wrong. Anyway, let me stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stern. That was amazing. I mean, I know as an incoming college freshman, I definitely learned so much from that, and like it really got me thinking.
You still have to
So,
go to college, though.
yes, thank you. Thank you. But really, it was really amazing and educational. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat and I can say them out loud. So, yeah.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Mr. Stern, you talked about the impulse or the instinct to hate as being quite natural. So from the impulse to action is a leap or a step. And is there any profiling of the kind of personalities that move from the constructs or the beliefs or the conspiracy theories to actually taking action? Is there any profile that you guys have come up with?
Well, there's going back to really after World War II. There was a guy by the name of Theodore Adorno who wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. And there's been some pushback, and it's sort of gotten revitalization in the last like 10 years or so. And there are some social psychologists that sort of look at what people are more likely to go into, to do certain things. But I think again, it's not just a question of, oh, this person is somehow abnormal and they're more likely. I think there's a variety of factors. I think there are political forces, there are cultural forces, there are all sorts of things that drive people to see the world in a certain way. And under certain circumstances there are people that can decide again to give their whole lives over to that. When I teach about anti-Semitism at Bard, I obviously include a couple of weeks about the Nazism, and I inevitably get a student who basically looks at Nazism as inherently sort of yucky. It's like, how could people think the world that way? How could they see the world that way? And I usually would challenge that student to say, the likelihood is that if you were living in that society at that time, at that place, and your friends were Nazis, and your parents were Nazis, and your school friends were Nazis, you probably would have been a Nazi too. So, there are a whole bunch of different factors, including how we see our group, our place in our group, and that's an important aspect of it. Thankfully, if you think about it, even though a person who commits a hate crime creates tremendous damage, creates tremendous pain in a community because everybody sees themselves as potentially being targeted. It's still relatively rare when you think about how many millions of people there are, so it's a small number of people that may actually go and act on that. But I don't know that you can say, put somebody in a sort of the Hogwarts sorting hat and say this person is more likely to do it than that. I mean, the FBI has done profiles of different types of people too, but again, it's complicated.
Sure, thank you.
Mr. Stern, thank you for giving us a framework on how we could think about hate. My question for you is, in the research you've done, or maybe your peers have done, what could be the explanation for hate being more pervasive now across the globe post-World War II, when we all went through several decades of relative peace and calm, but things seem to be exploding right now with hate across pretty much every corner of the earth.
Well, I think hate has always been, a problem. I mean, we had World War II, we had the Inquisition. You can go back to any time in society. But I agree with you that we're at a point where there's certainly much more xenophobia. There's much more fear of the stranger. Immigrants. And we see it with the pushes, for nationalistic parties in Europe. Although it was good news that Vox didn't get into to become a coalition partner, at least in the aftermath of this current Spanish election. But I think that the fear of the stranger, the fear of the other, the fear of our group losing out, is something that's easily stoked by politicians. I think it's a fear. I mean, the United States, one of the things that those of us who've been looking at this for decades, are anticipating, even we were wrong on the timing, we were anticipating this back at the time of Pat Buchanan, for those of you who remember running for president. And he was sort of tapping into the fear that America would become a majority, non-white society by 2050. And there are people who are fearful of that. I mean, for the rest of us, America is an idea. I mean, who the heck cares? But these folks care very deeply. And that, was a motivating factor for a lot of the politics. And, we see, I don't want to be partisan, but we see, Trump certainly feeding into that fear of, white Christian folk in particular, losing what they believe, was their birthright. So, I don't know if you thought about it, but when Charlottesville, when those folks were yelling, Jews will not replace us, this is about a Confederate statue. How did Jews get into this? Robert E. Lee, he wasn't Jewish. So the basic idea, I mean, again, when you think about hatred, one of the things to do is to do a thought experiment. See how you look at the world if you believe what these folks believe. And if you believed you're a white person who's superior to somebody who's non-white, and you believe you're losing to these folks, how could it possibly be that you'd be losing to somebody who's your inferior? It can't be if it is a fair, the world is fair. So that's where anti-Semitism comes in. It's the Jews behind the scenes suppressing whites as part of their, evil plan to control the world. So, there's that fear of the other. But it's, I think it's been exacerbated again because of demographic changes, by political use of the, social media has a role in this. Now, I don't like people who blame social media for everything. People blame the printing press, they blame radio, they blame television. There are new ways of communicating, and they each can create a sense of community. When I was writing my book about the militia movement, for example, one of the things that was clear, and this is back in 95, that the really early days of the internet there were bulletin boards and ways for these folks to communicate. Before that, it was just, when I first started working at AJC, the stuff that these guys were producing would come to, I would have a Dropbox in the FDR station on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. It would come in a brown paper envelope, and you wouldn't know, it would look like pornography or hate literature, right? But when the mid-90s came around, these folks were able to communicate and build a sense of community, have rumors spread, and that was part of what gave the power to the militias to grow from like 2 groups in early 94 to majority of states, and a year later having armed militias that were threatening federal officials and others. But the flip side of it was that it allowed me and about 25 other researchers to look at what these folks were doing in real time. So it gave us the capacity to have a better window and understanding. And I think that's one of the balances we're going to see the technology driving some of the hate more effectively. But I think if we're smart, we could also use where the clearinghouse idea and others come in to use the new tools as well to combat hatred. So it's a more complicated world. But I share your concern that the arc of history is more problematic now than it was a few years ago. But it also look at when I talk about anti-Semitism, just to give you a quick way of thinking about the complexity of this. People talking about the number of hate crimes going up. Attitudes are pretty much the same. I've faced a lot less anti-Semitism than my parents, my kids even less. And not to do comparative bigotries, but I tell people, look, George Santos, the congressman who lied about everything in Long Island to get elected, lied that he was Jewish. Could you imagine if he lied that he was Muslim? So there are a whole bunch of different data points that we have to look at to really get a temperature.
Thank you so much.
So-
You answered that really well. So actually, we have two more questions left. I think I see two people raising their hands. So if we can get both of those questions right now and you could kind of answer both of them at once, that would be amazing.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So Motika auntie and Suresh uncle.
Thanks. You're doing a great job, Megha. Thank you, Mr. Stern, for taking time out and speaking with us on this important subject. One of the questions I have is, where do you see the hatred amongst a child influenced more, from home or maybe sometime in our lives? Not just a child, let me correct that. As a person, where do we get hate more, from home or from outside? We do see radicalization, people really targeting certain people to bring them in their own fold. So where do you think the influence is most?
I don't know that I can say that it's one or the other. I think there are a lot of different sort of avenues to hatred. I think the lessons that you hear at home are important to how people talk about other people. And for me, one of the most informative things, so I went to public elementary school in New York that was like 90 some odd percent Black and Puerto Rican. I didn't even realize there was something called racism until I moved to Brooklyn when I was 11, because my friends were Black and Puerto Rican and others too. So that was an influence, I think, in some of my life's work. But we hear it from all different communities, from politicians on different tribal things. So I don't think there's a real simple answer, which is more. I think it's both. And let me take the last question too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Kenneth. So my question is, have you come across any research, or have you done any research where people who were anti-Semitic before, people who were Nazis before, have changed over course of several years, maybe interactions for whatever reason? And what did that research find out? Or what did they conclude as to why they changed, or what changed their perspective?
Yeah, there are some books that have been written, and there's actually a group that works with people that have come out of white supremacist groups. And I don't know that there's a single profile, but I've heard a similar enough story to say that there was basically something that happened to them that made them realize that this wasn't right. And just to give you one example, there was a guy named Floyd Cochran who was very involved with the Aryan nations in Idaho. And he was very clear about his support for neo-Nazi ideology, eugenics, and all those things. And then he learned that, according to Nazi ideology, the people with disabilities were not really worthy of life. They were, unnecessary eaters. Well, he had a child with a disability, And that got him thinking about the implications of his ideology. So there are again different avenues for this. If you type in Ku Klux Klan on Facebook, it'll take you to one of the groups that get people out of hate groups, and I'm sure they have a lot more information on their website.
So I have a comment on the question about why are we seeing a growth in hate crimes recently. I think globalization and the borders getting a little bit more permeous might have something to do with it, because we have earlier people weren't able to travel to other countries and reside there, and the borders were much more it was difficult to cross borders, and people stayed within their spaces. So I think that may be leading to a greater fear of the other coming and becoming the majority in what you viewed as your land. So that's something that, that's hypothesis of mine, but it's something that could certainly be researched or tested. And certainly what you talked about, the social media effect, there's a nice documentary on that called The Social Dilemma, which shows how it's created much more polarization in society, because, how these platforms tend to feed messages, the same kind of messages that you're prone to viewing. And so I don't know what's the plan to tackle that aspect of social media.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I listen. I mean, I agree with you. People are more mobile, and people are fleeing. A lot of refugees and so forth. And they're a fear that people have of somebody who's somebody wants to find an immigrant to somebody who came off the boat after you. So whether we see everybody, as being equally human and who the heck cares, or you see them as a threat, and politicians, seeing some mileage and playing into that fear is something that's happened. On social media, yeah, I think we get into our buckets, and it's also cable news that does it. The cable news business model, is whether it's MSNBC or it's Fox News, is again, there's a problem. It's a simple problem. It's their fault, and that's the sort of instinct to see things that way, and it's monetized. So that's a real tough challenge. I can tell you in my household, my wife goes crazy when I turn on Newsmax and Fox News, and she says, "How can you watch that?" And I say, "How can I not? I mean, there's billions of people that see the world that way. How having the intellectual curiosity to put myself in their shoes. I may not agree with them. I certainly don't. I might find some of the ideas deplorable. I do. But how can I not look at that, out of curiosity? The thing that's distressing is that there's one study that I know, and I hope there are others that show something different, that people got an incentive who are like in one bucket on social media to get feeds from the opposite bucket, and to see if that sort of humanized the people on the other side. And the answer is it didn't. It just made them more rigid. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that, but it is a challenge.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stern. So as we're winding down right now, I really just wanted to give you a really big thank you. There was unfortunately a good amount of people who couldn't attend, but I have recorded the whole thing, so we will share that as well. And I definitely think this got all of our gears turning. We're all thinking about this a lot more. And thank you everyone who joined. This was really, really amazing, and I think we all really enjoyed the discussion as well. So, yep, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night or good morning, wherever you're at.
Great. Thank you too. You take care. Enjoy college.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.